So to start off, we got Blind Willie Johnson, and Blind Willie Johnson is, I think, a really great example to start off with. Once again, with these artists that I speak about today, these are people who, even though they're on the timeline later, Blind Willie Johnson, for example, is on the timeline at 1927. These guys have been performing for a long time, and as I said also before, blues players like this, like Blind Willie Johnson and Charlie Patton, have been performing the blues for a while before, even during when W.C. Handy and other people were recording. It just wasn't brought in, and people like W.C. Handy kind of created that exposure, created that, started to open that market for people to kind of go out and find some of these, kind of real OG blues players who've been, or really almost second generation. Some of the, it's pretty close, but there is and people are not exactly sure when the blues officially started. It kind of was thought at one point to be in the early 1900s, but then it kept going back and moving back. And I don't know if we'll find out since, unfortunately, many of those people who are from that area or who had stories from that area, it's getting pretty late. And, not the whole issue to start out with was that so much of this was passed on orally and not written down. It's hard to say if we'll ever really know or have a solid date. But the people who taught Blind Willie Johnson or who they heard, were not that much older, but, about a generation older. So these guys are already almost the second generation of blues players, even though the blues was definitely still becoming a refined genre. So Blind Willie Johnson is an interesting person, and another layer to this, because another contrast to these musicians I'll speak about today and W.C. Handy and Mommy Smith and some of the other more famous vocalists who may have had more expanded backgrounds just in entertainment and music in general. You'll see that their history is much more, is documented much better. When I went through W.C. Handy and Mommy Smith, and specifically W.C. Handy, even though some of it is based on his word, you can see kind of his full life story documented, pre-music, pre-blues, post-blues. There's a lot of detail. I don't believe there's any question about his birth date or death date, and those details definitely are much more in question with people like Blind Willie Johnson. For example, Blind Willie Johnson, who was indeed blind, the story about how he was blinded is sort of an area of legend, and that kind of stuff is kind of, I think, a big attraction or a big something that pulls people into the blues. Some of it is just the lore. When you talk about people like Blind Willie Johnson, Robert Johnson, of course, is probably the most famous, and some of the kind of legend and maybe fantasy that kind of gets built up around them because there's a lack of history, clear documented history. But what Blind Willie Johnson, the most popular, the most common story you'll hear about how he was blinded was when he was 7 years old. His mother was in an argument with his father, and somehow during that argument, his mother throws or spills or something happens where lye, which if you've never heard of lye, Lye, it's pretty heavy stuff. It's pretty I don't know if it's acidic, but it's very what is it called? It'll it eats into your into tissue basically. But anyways, she throws lye and it hits Blind Willie Johnson in the eyes, which I don't know. I've never seen or I'm obviously photographic technology at the time was pretty limited. So I don't know if you would think that maybe there would be other damage done, and I don't remember, never read anything about that. But that is the most common legend. It might be the most dramatic, so that might be why it caught on. or it could be because that's what happened. But the other stories that you'll hear about him are that he was blinded because he had the wrong eyeglasses, which is, I don't know. And there's another story where he was looking into an eclipse with like a piece of, looking glass, and, he's looking directly in the eclipse. So of course the sun kind of messed up his eyes, blinded him. So, that one story clearly has more detail and is engaging. Definitely, I don't know if it's more tragic. All of them are pretty tragic. But yeah, who knows? I think you can see though how the lack of documentation or engagement with these individuals. It seems like based on these stories, you would be able to kind of, even from seeing the individual, you might be able to kind of figure out which one is true, which one isn't. So it can tell you about the level of exposure. But these guys were able to get recorded, unlike some of the early ones, because that opportunity, that window was opened by some of the earlier performance. There's curiosity. It was a new genre that people were starting to pick up wind on, and they were allowed to get in the studio. And I think, that it wasn't documented not only because the earlier careers weren't documented, but I think even for someone like W.C. Handy, they weren't necessarily following him earlier before in his career either. But I think there's a difference between when you're kind of a underground, unknown genre, and you're kind of roughing it and seen as an outsider, and you're not really recognized till later, even though you might have a really good cult following or build a pretty strong following, get commercial success. Those people are not necessarily, these music fans who are really engaged by your music are not necessarily going to have the same coverage as someone in the entertainment industry who is seen as more mainstream at the time, like a W.C. Handy or Mommy Smith, or even like a Bessie Smith or Ma Rainey, who even though some of them are more entrenched in the blues genre, they had a more of a presence in the entertainment industry. And I think there's a difference between when, like, if I'm a really good fan, if I'm going to see if I'm excited to see like a Marcus King band is in town, or Ron Artis, I'm not thinking about finding out, necessarily asking them about their history or their background at this point. I'm just like, wow, this is great music. This is something new I haven't heard before. And so I think that is a huge difference. I think maybe a more of a journalistic presence was around documenting, W.C. Handy, who was recognized in his time and after his time as a major contributor. Anyways, back to Blind Willie Johnson. He was really well known for he's from Texas. He was really well known for his slide technique. That's really what set him apart. He was very religious. He did some, in addition to playing on the streets when he was younger, because that was one place you were able to play. He also apparently did some street preaching, a street preacher, and he was Baptist, and he played some in the church, and as I said, he did some other performances around, but he spent a lot of time in Texas, where he's from, in that area where he was from, and really built up his playing catalog there. And because he was religious, it kind of contrasts. His music stylings were almost all of his songs had religious content. So it was accepted not only in the blues community, but the gospel community, even though his playing style is clearly, it's more heavily associated with the blues, but if you listen to the words and content, a lot of it is kind of preachy, or retelling stories from the Bible, and you can kind of imagine that being blind, this was a huge, important way for him to pass on his message through an oral tradition. Um, he wasn't able to read the Bible, so a lot of what he heard from other preachers and other religious discussion is really what he had, and he had to keep keep that in his memory and hold on to those details. And I think music is a great way to do that. Which is, I mean, it was the case for a lot of black people at the time, because at this time there's limited education, but at this point, one way or another, people were probably, this is post-slavery, one way or another, a lot of people were able to get an education, even if it wasn't up to, I guess, standards that people would expect. So basic reading and writing, though. Anyways, but for blind Willie Johnson, obviously, he has a disability, and the ability to retain information. It's going to be different. To acquire and retain information. So I think that was a huge piece, and one of the reasons, besides his individual beliefs and his ties to the community, and that he really was and did enjoy preaching and passing on the gospel to others. It also was a form of it was also a way to remember. And because of this, I think this is because he was so deeply religious, it was interesting because the blues generally was, I mean, not always, but a lot of blues musicians and blues music was not seen as appropriate by the church, by the black church, by the religious community overall, because a lot of taboo issues were covered just because of the background and the sort of journey that the blues took. A lot of unrest brought up a lot of social issues that you don't really talk about, brought a lot of relationship issues that you don't really talk about, and so Blind Willie Johnson's music really permeated all areas just because his content was acceptable, and it was just really a new playing style, and his vocal style is really unique. If you get a chance to listen to his vocal style, it's something, it's very interesting also. But one of the main reasons that I added him to the timeline, besides that he's just one of the early people, blues musicians, to get commercial success, was to highlight his slide playing technique. And generally he would either have a metal ring or he'd take a pocket knife and he would use that as a slide on his guitar. And as traditional Delta blues, a lot of Delta blues players do when they're going to do a slide technique, his guitar is often tuned to drop D, which, if you don't know, that's when the top string, which is typically tuned to E, they tune it down and they're able to play sort of bass rhythm, bass notes on the D string, and they can play their melody and whatnot. Use the slide on the rest of the lower 5 strings, and either sing along or playing along with that. And so if you listen to his most famous song, most well-known song is Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground, which is essentially supposed to recreate the event of Christ's crucifixion. And now, so the original song did not have words. Later editions or later variations, which usually they change the title of the song, but are based on the song. It did not have words, and it was really supposed to recreate the atmosphere what it was like during the crucifixion of Christ, and it's a really I think it does a great job. If you ever get a chance to listen to it, it'll probably be posted on the website at some point, bluelineage.com, but you can find it anywhere, and it has a very kind of grim. Obviously, it was a sad event, and the way it kind of flows and carries out, he does, even though there's no vocals, he does add a sort of he adds a melodic hum that really, in addition to a slide guitar, which is kind of a not wailing, but I don't want to say scream either, but it's a very pronounced sound that really, it really does a great job of setting the scene and the atmosphere of what you can only imagine people were going through at the time. If you were around Christ at those times in mourning. And so that song caught on. It was one of his most successful songs, and it's just kind of groundbreaking, because not only it's the song itself, I think, transcends through history. It still holds up. Obviously, as we've talked about early, recording technology was limited, so sometimes you either need to listen to modern performances of songs, or just kind of have to keep in mind the limitations of recording technology. But either way, it's a really great piece, and it was actually included when the Voyager 1 space probe first launched. Included were I think they called it the Golden Record. I forget exactly what it was named, but it was the record. I do believe it was a record, like a phonograph record for a record player. But I could be wrong. It might have been a different device. But based on the time, it would have had to been a record. Or maybe it could have been a tape. Tapes would have been. I believe it was a record. I'm pretty sure. Anyways, so when they launched Voyager 1 space probe, it's still out there today, floating around space. There was this whole concept about, if there's life out there or somebody out there in space, we want them to see like the most incredible works created by humankind. And this song was included on the music portion of that, the record that they sent out to space. So that's a fun fact about Blind Willie Johnson.